My dear friends, art lovers, curious minds, and fellow explorers of the human spirit, a very warm welcome to COGITART. Today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to pull at a loose thread in the immaculate tapestry of one of the 20th century's greatest geniuses. We are going to talk about Paul KLEE. KLEE, the poet of colors, the master of the dream world, the painter of charming goldfish, naive angels, and smiling moons, right? The gentle, universally beloved grandfather of modern art. That is the image you've been sold. It's a comfortable image, a sanitized one, almost childlike in its simplicity. Well, prepare yourselves. Today, we are going to set that photograph on fire. We are going to dive deep into the life of a man whose complexity, whose private pains, and whose closely guarded secrets would make the most docile of biographies blush. We will talk about the unsettling truth of Paul KLEE, the very things that he, an obsessively private and controlling man, would have detested you knowing about his personal life. And I guarantee you this, after today, you will never look at a KLEE painting in the same way again. And to ensure this investigative journey reaches as many inquisitive minds as possible, I ask you, right from the start, to do 3 simple but powerful things. Subscribe to the Artologos channel right now, if you haven't already. Leave a like on this video so the platform understands the relevance of our work. And most importantly, share this content with everyone you know. Send it to your group chats, to your friends, to that professor who might also need to rethink their assumptions. Help us challenge the easy narratives. I'm counting on you. Now, hold on tight. The descent into the true universe of Paul KLEE begins. Now, the first lie, or rather, the first half-truth, that we must demolish is that of the spontaneous genius, of a talent that springs from the soul like a pure fountain. KLEE was no noble savage who stumbled into brilliance. He was, and this is absolutely fundamental, a rigorously disciplined intellectual, an obsessive theorist, almost a scientist of art. His appearance of simplicity is the most successful disguise in the history of modern art. Born to a German music teacher and a Swiss singer, the young Paul was a musical prodigy. By the age of 11, he was already an extraordinary violinist with the Bern Municipal Orchestra. Music, with its unyielding structure, its mathematical precision, its ironclad discipline, was his first language, and it would never leave him. It was the bedrock of his thinking. His father, a stern and pragmatic man, saw a secure future in music and a path to bohemian destitution in art. KLEE's rebellion was not that of a passionate, explosive artist in the Romantic tradition. It was the calculated rebellion of a young intellectual who chose the visual arts precisely because he sensed it was a virgin territory to be conquered with the same intellectual rigor that music demanded. He didn't just want to feel art, he wanted to dissect it, to understand its primary components, to create a definitive grammar for visual chaos. His youthful diaries, which he later meticulously edited and re-edited with an almost paranoid care, to construct his own legend, reveal a young man tormented by insecurity, by social inadequacy, and, let's be blunt and politically incorrect, by a confused and often frustrated libido. He was not the ethereal, otherworldly being from his paintings. He was a man of flesh and blood, beset by desires, envy, and a capacity for cruel self-analysis. In his formative years in Munich, at the turn of the century, he felt like a fish out of water. While Expressionism was exploding around him in a riot of visceral emotion and raw, clashing color, the world of artists like Ernst Ludwig Kirchner and the Die Brücke group, KLEE was hunched over anatomical studies and experimenting with arcane techniques like reverse glass painting. He was seeking not the explosion, but absolute control. He spent nearly a decade, from his 20s into his 30s, in a frustrating search for a unique voice, producing satirical, grotesque, and often deeply melancholic works that bear little resemblance to the KLEE the world would come to celebrate. He was a master of the line, a draftsman of incredible skill, but one thing eluded him. One thing terrified him: color. He writes explicitly in his diaries about his fear of color, about his inability to master it. The future poet of color was, in his youth, chromatically timid, almost impotent. His early work is dominated by black and white etchings and drawings, a world of form without the lifeblood of hue. And here we enter one of the most delicate points, one that KLEE would certainly have preferred to keep swept under the rug of history: his marriage to the Bavarian pianist Lili Stumpf. The official narrative paints a picture of a blissful union of artistic souls. The reality, as always, is far more complex and, for its time, was frankly scandalous. Lili was a strong, talented, and crucially, a pragmatic woman. While KLEE was lost in his theories and struggled to sell a single drawing, it was Lili who supported the household for years by giving piano lessons. Paul KLEE, the future icon of the Bauhaus, spent the early years of his marriage as a houseman, or house husband. He looked after their son, Felix. He cooked, he cleaned, while his wife was the breadwinner. Imagine the psychological weight of this for a man in the early 20th century in a profoundly patriarchal society. This inversion of traditional roles, while it may seem progressive to us today, was for him a source of immense anguish and, I dare say, a certain humiliation that he sublimated into his art. He was not the provider patriarch, the master of the house. He was the reclusive, dependent artist, living in a kind of domestic cocoon financed by his wife. This dynamic, this constant tension between the traditionally feminine world of the home and his desperate search for an autonomous masculine and artistic identity, is the secret key to understanding so many of his works. The house, the garden, the domestic objects, the cats, all of this becomes his microcosm, not out of a purely poetic choice, but out of biographical necessity. He transformed his gilded cage into his personal laboratory. The views from his window, the plants on the sill, his son's toys. These were not just charming subjects. They were the boundaries of his world. The turning point, the moment that art history loves to romanticize, is the famous trip to Tunisia in 1914 with his friends Auguste Macke and Louis Moillet. It is there that he writes his celebrated, ecstatic phrase, "Color and I are one. I am a painter." Beautiful, isn't it? It sounds like a magic trick, an epiphany under the African sun. But this is a gross oversimplification. Tunisia did not give him color. Tunisia validated a decade of exhausting theoretical work. He did not arrive there as a blank canvas that was suddenly splashed with light. He arrived with a mind buzzing with theories on optics, on the decomposition of light, on the emotional impact of every single hue. What he saw in the architecture of Tunis, in the vibrant markets of Kairouan, was not just exotic beauty. He saw the living confirmation of his hypotheses. He saw his theoretical grids, his checkerboard structures, filled in by the light and color of the real world. The watercolors he painted there, like in the style of Kairouan, are not spontaneous outpourings. They are structured, geometric patchworks of translucent color, where squares of pink, blue, and ochre are laid down with the precision of a mosaicist. The trip was the final experiment that proved his theory worked. So, the unsettling truth here is that even the most lyrical and spontaneous-seeming moment of his career was, in fact, the climax of a cerebral and methodical process. KLEE did not surrender to color. He conquered it with reason. Shortly after this conquest, the world collapses. The First World War erupts. His friend and travel companion, Auguste Macke, is killed in combat within months. Franz Marc, another central pillar of their Blue Rider group, also dies at the front. KLEE is conscripted into the German army, but by a strange twist of fate, he is not sent to the trenches. He spends the war painting camouflage on airplanes and working as a clerk far behind the lines. Think of the cognitive dissonance. While Europe was bleeding out in mud and gore, KLEE was living a life of bureaucratic routine, quietly honing his art in secret, shielded from the direct horror of the front. This distance, this protected position as an observer, marked his work forever. He does not paint the war literally, like Otto Dix or George Grosz, whose works are a visceral scream from the trenches. KLEE represents it through symbols, metaphors, and allegories. His demons, his fallen angels, his fragmented landscapes are not direct visions of battle. but the distillation of a historical anxiety, of a world that has lost its meaning. He becomes a seismograph of the European soul, registering the tremors not on its surface but in its deepest tectonic plates. And then comes fame. The war ends, and in 1920, KLEE receives an invitation from the architect Walter Gropius to become one of the masters at the most revolutionary school of art and design of all time, the Bauhaus. Here, KLEE's public image is consolidated. Might is the wise professor, the revered theorist, a colleague of giants like Wassily Kandinsky, Lionel Feininger, and Oskar Schlemmer. His courses on form and color theory were legendary, so complex and abstract that many students confessed to not understanding a thing, yet they left the classroom feeling they had touched upon something fundamental. He published his pedagogical sketchbook, a small book that is a veritable Bible of modernist thought, where he dissects the creative process with the precision of a botanist analyzing a plant. "A line is a dot that went for a walk," he famously stated. It sounds simple, but behind that phrase lies a universe of philosophy about dynamics, time, and space, the very genesis of form. But what would KLEE detest us knowing about his Bauhaus years? First, that he lived in a constant, quiet rivalry with Kandinsky. They were friends, yes, neighbors in the masters' houses in Dessau, and colleagues, but they represented two opposing poles of abstraction. Kandinsky was the Russian mystic, expansive, symphonic, seeking spirituality in grand compositions and improvisations. KLEE was the introverted Swiss, a master of Kammermusik, chamber music, intimate and on a small scale, seeking the underlying rule, the structure, the genesis of form. In the microcosm, Kandinsky wanted to paint the entire orchestra, KLEE, the string quartet. This tension, though friendly, was palpable. Second, and more importantly, the Bauhaus, with its utopian vision of functionality and mass production, was in many ways in direct conflict with KLEE's soul. He believed art was an organic, mysterious, almost metaphysical process. "Art does not reproduce the visible," he wrote. "Rather, it makes visible." For him, art was a parallel to creation itself, the more radical wing of the Bauhaus, especially. Under Gropius's successor, the staunch Marxist Hannes Meyer, preached that art must serve a social function, that it should be an instrument for the proletariat. They saw KLEE's work as a bourgeois daydream, individualistic and useless. KLEE suffered immensely under this pressure. He felt increasingly isolated, a mystic in a world of engineers. His decision to leave the Bauhaus in 1931 for a quieter position at the Düsseldorf Academy was not just a career change, it was an escape. He was fleeing the dogmatism and politicization that threatened to suffocate the mystery he so cherished in art. The unsettling truth is that the great master of the Bauhaus never felt completely at home at the Bauhaus. He was the strange angel in the nest of functionalist modernity. And if you are enjoying this deep dive, this deconstruction of myths, remember that this is exactly what we do here at COGITART. So, if you haven't done so yet, now is the time. Click that subscribe button and activate the notification bell. Your support is the fuel that allows us to keep digging deep into art history. The escape to Düsseldorf, however, was short-lived. KLEE had barely had time to settle in before the greater catastrophe befell him and all of Germany. In 1933, the Nazis seized power. Modernity, intellectual freedom, experimentalism, everything the Bauhaus had represented became a crime. KLEE, with his childish, incomprehensible, and allegedly Jewish art, though he was not Jewish, became a prime target. His house was searched by the Gestapo. He was summarily dismissed from his teaching post, accused of being a cultural Bolshevik and a producer of degenerate art, Entartete Kunst. More than 100 of his works were confiscated from German museums. 17 of them were included in the infamous Degenerate Art exhibition of 1937 in Munich, hung chaotically and accompanied by defamatory slogans so that the public could mock and despise them. Imagine the scene. Paul KLEE, the man of control, the meticulous theorist, the artist who had spent his life constructing a private universe governed by its own laws, sees that universe brutally invaded, vandalized, and exposed to public execration. This is the breaking point. This is the moment when KLEE's life transforms from an intellectual drama into a Greek tragedy. How does a man like him, so sensitive, so private, react to such a devastating blow? What happens to his art when the outside world becomes not just indifferent, but actively hostile and threatening? The answer to that question defines the final and most powerful chapter of his life and work. He goes into exile. He returns to Bern, in Switzerland, the city of his youth. But it is not a triumphant homecoming. It is the flight of a refugee. Switzerland, with its cautious neutrality and suspicious bureaucracy, delayed granting him his final citizenship. He was an outcast in his own homeland, and then, as if the political and psychological torment were not enough, fate dealt him its final, cruelest blow. In 1935, he began to feel the symptoms of a rare, incurable, and terribly cruel disease, systemic scleroderma. It is an autoimmune disorder that causes the progressive hardening and tightening of the skin and connective tissues. The skin, the very organ of touch, the boundary between the self and the world, began to turn into armor, a prison. His hands, once capable of the most delicate calligraphic filigree, became stiff and claw-like. Swallowing became difficult. Breathing, an effort. This is the abyss. The man who saw the line as a dot going for a walk can now barely move his hands. The artist who celebrated organic growth now sees his own body petrify. What does he do? Does he give up? Does he fall silent? No. He does the opposite. In the last 5 years of his life, sick, exiled, and persecuted, Paul KLEE experienced the most extraordinary creative explosion of his entire career. It is here that the unsettling truth becomes a sublime truth. His art transforms radically. The fine, delicate lines give way to thick, black, almost brutal strokes, as if they were carved with Herculean effort. The colors become either darker or, paradoxically, more feverish, as if burning with a final urgency. His themes become explicit in their confrontation with pain, death, and destruction. It is in this period that his famous angels emerge. But forget the cherubs of the Baroque. KLEE's angels are fragile, imperfect, often broken creatures. The most famous of them, Angelus Novus, though painted earlier in 1920, it gained its deepest resonance in this context through the interpretation of his friend, the philosopher Walter Benjamin, is the angel of history. Benjamin, who owned the painting, described it as an angel looking at the past and seeing a single catastrophe that piles wreckage upon wreckage at its feet. The angel would like to stay, to awaken the dead and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that he can no longer close them. This storm, Benjamin wrote, propels him irresistibly into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm, Benjamin concludes, is what we call progress. KLEE painted this angel, but it was his life in the late 1930s that embodied its tragedy. He paints masterpieces like Insula Dulcamara, Bittersweet Island, a poignant semi-abstract map of his own condition, and the terrifying Death and Fire, with its schematic skull, a pale figure marching towards it, and the German word for death, Tod, embedded in the composition. His figures become hieroglyphs, pictograms of suffering. The puppets and marionettes, always a recurring theme, now appear broken, dismembered, controlled by unseen, malevolent forces. He is no longer interested in formal beauty. He is creating documents of survival. Every painting is an act of resistance against physical and spiritual annihilation. That obsessive control from the beginning of his career gives way to a direct, almost primal expression. He no longer has time for filigree. He must cry out his truth. And what would he detest us knowing? That this final, most potent, most universally human phase of his work was forged in the fires of hell. It was the illness, the persecution, and the proximity of death that finally liberated him from his last intellectual restraints and transformed him from a genius of form into a prophet of the human condition. The final irony is a cruel one. His Application for Swiss citizenship was finally approved, but the official notification arrived only days after his death in June 1940. He died stateless. The man who gave the world one of the richest visual universes ever created died officially belonging nowhere. So, who was Paul KLEE? He was the frustrated musician who became a grand theorist of art. He was the husband supported by his wife who turned the domestic sphere into a cosmos. He was the obsessive intellectual who gave us an art that seems born from a child's dream. He was the master of the Bauhaus, who felt like a stranger in the house of modernity. He was the degenerate artist humiliated by Nazism who became a symbol of the freedom of the human spirit. And he was the dying man, imprisoned in his own body, who produced his most vital and eternal art. The unsettling truth about Paul KLEE is not a sexual scandal or an artistic fraud. It is something far more profound. It is the realization that the art that seems to us the lightest, most poetic, and most serene can be born from the heaviest of burdens, the deepest of sufferings, and the most rigorous and painful discipline. KLEE teaches us that creativity is not a divine gift that falls from the sky. It is an achievement. It is a struggle. It is an act of will against chaos, against pain, against mortality itself. He would have detested that we dissect his personal life, that we violate his so zealously guarded privacy. But in doing so, we do not diminish him. On the contrary, we enlarge him. We cease to see the magician and instead find the man. And it is in KLEE's humanity, with all its contradictions, its fears, and its ultimate courage, that his true and immortal genius resides. He showed us that even when the body petrifies and the world falls apart, it is still possible to take a dot and lead it for a walk, creating a path of light in the densest darkness. I hope this journey into the heart of Paul KLEE has been as revealing for you as it is for me every time I study his story. True knowledge is that which transforms us. If you felt that transformation, if you now see a new universe behind KLEE's lines and colors, then our mission here at COGITART has been accomplished. I ask you one last time to solidify your support. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, comment with what impacted you most in this analysis, and please share it, and most importantly, don't stop here. COGITART is filled with other investigations like this one into other giants of art. Click on one of the videos appearing on your screen now and continue your journey with us. Because art is long, life is short, and there are many more myths we still need to burn. Thank you so much, and until next time.